from one of our first members of that joined our coalition after we formed it, which was now called the National Consortium of Secondary STEM Schools, of which Illinois Math and Science Academy was a member. So I don't know if you guys know Chris or not, but he mentioned he was involved in this group. So it's sort of a full circle moment for me running into somebody I knew in another life in the policy arena. So I have some slides. I'm going to share them if that's okay. And I never have good luck making all this work, so give me a moment to get it all set up. Kate, do you have it set up where participants can share their screen?
Yep, should be set up that way. I've got multiple participants can share.
All right, just a second. All right, can you see me? Okay, good. Take a minute to load on my screen. I just rebooted my computer like 5 seconds ago, Kate. So it took. That's why I was late joining, because my PowerPoint hadn't opened yet. So let's see what happens.
No worries. Yeah, and it looks good on my end. There you go.
Okay. All right. Great. So so let me start off. This is particularly apropos as an image this afternoon because we're under a tornado warning here in suburban Maryland. And I grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, where those things are a real thing. And I know you've had some activity in your area, but this is my analogy for Washington, because depending on your circumstances, you know, what goes on the national stage, and particularly in Congress in Washington and the nation's capital, looks different depending on your circumstances, right? If you're in the middle of a drought and this is a coming rainstorm, it's a good thing. If you're saturated and this is the last storm that's going to finish you off, it's a really bad thing. And I think, you know, we sort of acknowledge in whenever we talk about national policy issues that the least favorite phrase in the world to hear from anybody in the real world is, I'm here from Washington and I'm here to help you. So I wanted to acknowledge that at the outset, that, you know, Washington has a different look to everyone depending on what's going on. And, you know, one of my favorite analogies for what Congress does is they only do two things. They do nothing and overreact. And so, you know, whatever's going on at the moment feels like somewhat of a permanent crisis to most people watching what's going on in Washington, D.C., whether it's, you know, the events going on or things that have transpired. I just sort of want to set that out there from the outset. So let me, before I go into this, let me just say a little bit about who we are as a coalition. So the STEM Education Coalition is an alliance of three different sectors, really. One's the business community and employers, and that's all different shapes and sizes nowadays, not just the usual tech company, usual suspects you think of in the tech world like Microsoft and Apple and so forth, although they are members of our coalition. You've got agribusiness, you have auto repair, you have aviation maintenance and airlines and all sorts of other things that span the whole length of the economy. So the STEM issue is really a broad issue in that respect. And then we have all the education groups, so the science teachers, the math teachers, and different disciplines and so forth, as well as those in higher education and after school and informal learning. And then the third group are our professional societies, which are the professions themselves, so the chemists, the physicists, the different engineering branches, and also groups like the Society for Women Engineers, the National Society for Black Engineers, the Hispanic engineers, and so forth, that represent different marginalized communities in the STEM field. What holds us together is this notion of supporting science, technology, engineering, and math in every venue we can, both at the state level, where we have partnerships with roughly 30 different state partners in some shape or form, where we work on state by state policy issues. And we also have a robust portfolio at the national level, where we work on a whole variety of things. And that's kind of my segue to what's on the radar screen, because there's a lot of things going on that relate to science, technology, engineering, and math at the given moment, and they manifest themselves in a lot of different ways. So it feels like an eternity ago, but Congress just a couple of weeks ago passed the fiscal year 2022 spending bill. That was about 6 months after the start of the fiscal year in 2022, but that was something that the president signed. I've got a couple slides on that just to sort of show you what's in it. It was a historically large increase in funding for education on top of all of the relief funds. And I'll show you some of those numbers, but that was something that was sort of clearing the decks, if you will, in an election year that Congress got done, but we sort of avoiding a government shutdown feels like a good day in Washington, D.C. sometimes. So that's the sort of first thing. Another thing that is of interest to the STEM community in particular is the fact that this bill contained earmarks for the first time in more than a dozen years. So that's notable because there were something like 2,000 earmarks in this bill, and about 80% of them were education related. So if you have a project involving a school that you can seek funding from a particular federal program, you may not have gone after those opportunities last year, but it's something to take a look at both as an ecosystem and schools, and to ask around as questions. What's our school asking for? What's our district asking for? What's our community asking for of our members of Congress? They have all this information out on their websites now. And it's worth taking a look if it's something you maybe did a long time ago or have never looked at. But if there's been a lapse there, it's worth taking a look at your local members of Congress, getting to know where they are on earmarks, because this is a venue that used to exist quite commonly for a long time, and then I think it's out of people's mind. But it's a good way to get access to funds, and some of the ecosystems are certainly at a point where you can put together a credible request. So that's the second sort of radar screen. The president's budget came out on Monday. Is that right? Monday. On Monday morning. And, lots of ambitious things in there. There are a lot of teacher recruitment mechanisms in the budget. The budget means less as a document and as a plan than it does as a value statement these days, because the Congress kind of has its own budget process, and the administration's budget, Democrat, Republican, popular, unpopular, that's a chance for a statement of values. And one of the things that President Biden has done is very clearly make education a budget and spending priority. So there's upward pressure from the president's budget on education budgets going forward. In particular, one of the things they've focused on is the need to address the teacher supply issue, the teacher shortage issue. And, and this is probably apropos of this conversation, the Secretary of Education, in parallel with the budget, put out a letter to all school districts saying, we're encouraging you to use the available rescue plan funds to hire teachers. And that itself is sort of a Rorschach test in terms of priorities, because my reaction to that was, what do you mean you have to tell people to use the funds for that purpose? If it's need, it will happen, right? But even the Secretary of Education is sort of scratching his head at how districts and states are not using funds to cover those gaps. Obviously, the Russia-Ukraine situation is a daily occurrence. It has an impact on things like science and technology and postures around STEM issues. So it's an issue for the space program, for example. It's hard to get people to space without the collaboration of the Russians, which affects a major science agency. It's realigning university programs left and right in terms of our collaborations, and it has all sorts of splinter down effects in the economy in different ways that affect the STEM disciplines and the STEM fields and STEM jobs. So it's something that affects a lot of different things. All of the formal American Rescue Plan and successor bill funds have been committed, but we'll talk about what that means. What it means is those funds have flowed from the federal government to states. And what happens with those funds after that is a state by state and a district by district matter. But all of those funds have now been distributed from the federal government to states. They have to be spent on a timeline that goes out several years, but they're all out there and available for various different purposes. I'll say a little bit more about that. Obviously, we're living in an environment where inflation is a really big deal. I saw something the other day that said the average household was going to look at something like a $5,000 a household hit in terms of inflation. So that's a consideration. It's interesting to see that school districts are already providing the feedback that the federal dollars they have are not going as far as they expected them to go. And that's, schools are exposed to a lot of inflationary pressures as well. And it's going to affect the sort of dynamic of what do schools and districts ask funding for, and, what's our plan to adjust for inflation. So that's, another dynamic that's playing into the already very complicated environment that we're dealing with. There is a piece of legislation called the America Competes Act that is now under consideration in Congress. If you've followed this issue for some time, you may have heard this term before. The first America Competes Act passed in 2006, and it was a proposal essentially doubling investments in the United States in basic sciences in the physical sciences, so chemistry, physics, the other physical sciences. It had a huge impact on NSF's budget, the National Science Foundation, and other STEM programs. It had a lot of initiatives around teacher recruitment and so forth. It's back. It's a bipartisan bill, and this time it has a little bit different focus, and I'll get into that a little bit more. I could put a question mark after, is the Build Back Better Act dead or not? That was the major vehicle that the president proposed last year for changes in, amongst other things, childcare, healthcare, community college tuition. I mean, it had a variety of provisions that touched on education. It's notable in its, I mean, I hope I'm not being premature in saying this, but I think politically speaking, we're too close to the election cycle for this to have any life. But it matters in how the Biden administration is packaging what it's doing in education, because many of its education initiatives were embedded in the Build Back Better framework. And so that's part of the reason why you see a really ambitious budget request, and you will see the president talking about other education initiatives like teacher recruitment now outside of the construct of the Build Back Better Act. They sort of put all their eggs in that basket, if you will, and now they're looking for a new basket, is the way I would put that. We're going to have potentially a vote as early as next week on the Supreme Court nomination. And so that's been a big focus of Congress the last couple of weeks. It's garnered, some attention. I don't think it's the highest profile issue that we've had in past confirmation processes, which is a sign it's probably going to go through really quickly. But that's something that, obviously shapes a lot of expectations at the national level in terms of policy. And the Brown versus Board of Education was debated in the Supreme Court nomination hearing last week. So it's definitely a factor. And then the last two factors are sort of, again, kind of question marks. There are a lot of Democratic retirements in Congress, a little more than 30 as of the last time I saw it. That is generally a sign that those people retiring expect to be in the minority in the next Congress. So that's one bellwether. Public opinion is sort of squarely around the side of there being a shift in Congress. I think it's a question of how big that shift is, but the momentum is clearly in one direction, and I think that's going to affect what gets done and what doesn't. And then the final factor that's on our radar screen is, are we dealing with a pandemic now or an endemic? Right? The schools are certainly dealing with this at one end of the spectrum, but other parts of the economy are sort of moving in a back to normal dynamic, and I think that that's another factor. So this is what we look at on a daily basis in our organization, and what we sort of see as the factors that are influencing all the different policy decisions that get made in Washington. So let me talk, and I can pause here if you want to do, people can raise their hands. I can only see a couple of screens, so Kate, I'll rely on you if anybody has any questions, but let me just pause for a second, see if anybody does. Okay, well, let me dig a little bit deeper into some of these things. Oh, skip one. Okay. All right, so just to put education spending in the last omnibus spending bill in perspective, this was the largest year-over-year increase in federal spending on education at the Department of Education in a long time. So roughly almost a $3 billion increase in federal funding year over year. A big part of that was Title I funding. So you're going to see something like a 7 to 8% increase in federal funding flowing to school districts over the next fiscal year. And of course, it's going to happen in a 6-month period of time rather than over the course of a year, because we're already 6 months into the fiscal year. So I would imagine there are traditionally March and July flows of federal funds to the districts from the Department of Education. So you may have one larger one that's twice as big in July. So that's just sort of the normal cycle, but it's something to keep on a lookout for as you interact with people involved in the school system and to be aware of. But it's a historic increase. I expect you'll continue to see education funding going up. Certainly on the predicate of five months of learning loss in math has a significant remediation burden associated with it. I would assert that it's probably larger than that, but it's some large number, and I think it's going to garner attention for education funding. Will come with that in the background over the next several years as we sort of look at more depth of that, as that's a metric that people become familiar with of how much time have we lost in each subject. What do we need to make up? So that's last year's budget. Kate, you asked me to talk a little bit about what's in the relief funding. So I want to talk about that a little bit. This is relative size of the per pupil spending in the 4 there are three big buckets, and then the omnibus appropriations bill that passed, right? So Title I IDEA, that's the total funds on an annual basis that are flowing from the federal government to states on a per pupil basis. And then you had the CARES Act, which was March 2020, the very quickly passed funding that had a relatively small component of education. That was the funding that got testing and the vaccine efforts and other things in the pipeline, if you will. Then you had the very large relief plan that came right after the election in 2020. That was pretty big, but by Washington standards, it wasn't as big as the American Rescue Plan that passed in March of 2021 last year. So, these all together are something like $4,000 per pupil in federal spending that all arrived at the school districts within a relatively short period of time. And I will tell you, talking to lots of different districts, there's something like federal funding fatigue, if that's a term, out there in terms of being overwhelmed with how to efficiently spend these funds. I haven't heard a lot of happy stories about these funds showed up at our school and here's what we did with them. I've heard many, many more. I don't know what happened to this funding as a teacher, as an administrator. They seem to be, the awareness and the involvement in that decision-making was very much at the high end of the food chain in terms of state and district level decision-making, because amongst other things, one difference was in the beginning, when the Every Student Succeeds Act passed that replaced No Child Left Behind in 2015, it required a lot of stakeholder involvement processes in that. So you had some sense that there was, you had a seat at the table in terms of those priorities. There was nothing like that because we were, in a crisis and trying to get these dollars out the door. So they were left at the discretion of sort of the leadership of districts and states. So there wasn't a formal process in many places to be involved in how these funds were being spent. So you had to ask and you had to probe and prod and find those things out, a number of different ways because they were not widely reported. This is a good source for information on tracking where your state has spent COVID dollars to date. And what you can see is, like one of the things you'll see if you looked at this, and I've taken several dives at this. Our members look pretty closely at this, but FIRST Robotics is something you'll see some of the spending focused on in the STEM arena. That's probably the largest single STEM related program that you'll see evidenced in how these funds are spent. So a number of districts have specifically said, we're going to use these funds to create additional FIRST Robotics teams. Beyond that, it's really hard to find a single STEM thing that has enough theme behind it or enough instances behind it that sort of stand out as here's an example of how states and districts have used relief funds to support science, technology, engineering, and math. You tend to see there's some markers in there for math that are specifically directed to learning loss, but that's about as far as I could say. And we're only starting to really look at these examples of how the funding is being used. So we're kind of at the early stages of looking at all this money. And of course, it doesn't have to be spent until the end of 2020, the fiscal year 2024. And one other trend here, and this is why I would say it's worth asking, figuring out who your district and state leadership is with regard to federal funding decisions, because mostly what I've heard is that while the funds were distributed from the federal government to states and some of it to districts already, a lot of those funds are back end loaded in the sense that there are a lot of decisions yet to be made because a lot of states and districts have held on to those funds because they weren't certain how it would interface with capital projects and how it would interface with sustainability. Meaning, what can we commit of those funds to things like salary and payroll and long-term footprint without understanding what the state's commitment is to those sorts of things over a period of time as well. So I would say there are a lot of these funds still up for grabs in terms of how they're going to be directed long-term. So let me just pause here and see if anybody has any questions.
Okay. James, I don't know if you're planning to get into this. I sort of have like a very rudimentary understanding of the process for ESSER funding. That went through, like, states had to submit plans to the Department of Education. Those were approved. They go to the states and then they go to local education agencies through there for allocation. Can you kind of go through like the process and the timeline of the ESSER fund allocation stuff?
Sure. So, I mean, everything you said is right. What's missing from this equation is, in order to be eligible for the funds, you simply had to send a letter to the department saying, we will spend this funding in accordance with the Every Student Succeeds Act. So you didn't have to give too much detail in terms of how you were going to spend these funds. You had to commit that you're only going to spend these funds on activities that were authorized under federal law, in addition to the pandemic related activities. And I don't know if I don't think I put a slide in here, but you could spend these funds on anything authorized under federal law already, meaning anything in Title I, anything in Title II, anything in the Title IV Part A academic enrichment grants or after school, anything that was an acceptable use for federal funds before the pandemic. Those were all fine going forward. And then there were a number of pandemic related purposes, hygienic equipment, ventilation, PPE, other things that were directly involved in school resources around that, and nurses and other things that were, funding for that sort of thing. But that's the level of commitment. And you had to commit, and some of the states have fudged on this, on supplementing state funding, not supplanting state funding with these funds. And if we were, and I don't know the situation in Missouri, but I do know that New York State and California played some rather serious games with using federal education funds to supplant state funds, because they have a different education formula than some other states, and the governor had the authority to do that with their own discretion. So there are definitely games being played that doesn't fit the standard model. But what you said was right. These funds were applied for, they were distributed to the states, and I don't know yet what percentage exactly has been distributed to the districts, but it's something around 40%, with 100% flowing to the states, and some less than 100%, some less than half flowing to the districts now. And generally speaking, what happens is the funding falls under the discretion of the Title I funding coordinator at the district level. That's as much granularity as I could generalize, that whoever is the district decision maker around Title I is the default decision maker around these funds, because they're closely tied to the Title I formula for obvious reasons. So that's as much detail as we know at this point for how that works. Timeline wise, basically you have until next September to make decisions about how all those funds will be spent, and then they have to be spent, physically spent by the districts by September, the end of September 2024.
So I have a question, and I'm way behind where everybody else is. I'm new to this. So what is the ESSER fund that you talked about, Kate? What is that?
So I always have to Google what it actually stands for. It's the Elementary and Secondary School Emergency Relief Fund. So this was part of the American Rescue Plan Act, right, James? Or am I wrong on that one?
That's right. So if you look on this slide, ESSER, the thing you're talking about, was set up by the CARES Act in March of 2020. That's the emergency relief fund that leaves all the decisions at the state education agency and a small portion at the governor's discretion. The numbers on these slides per pupil are the amounts that ESSER would provide to the schools.
So is there a link where we can, I guess it's just that state link, the USA spending.gov, that will tell us how much money is still at Missouri that can be requested? Okay.
That's right. And the state education departments generally also have a website that shows the same kind of transparency in just their state. You may find some additional details there, but what this website will show, if you take a look at it, is the different buckets of funding and how much. And it's generalizing a little bit by the different parts of the law. That's about as granular as we get. In other words, you can see if an ESSER dollar was spent on some existing purpose under federal law, meaning like it was used for Title I to supplement Title I funds or Title II funds, but you can't see too much beyond that.
Okay.
And then there is information on DESE's website, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education in Missouri, that lists the ESSER allocations for each school district and so each local educational agency, so school districts and then charter management organizations. And I can distribute that with follow-up information after.
Okay, that'd be great.
Okay, any other questions? I see, hi, Chris, I see you've joined. So you're not a ghost. I felt like I was talking about somebody nobody knew there for a second. Nice to see you, Chris.
Hi, James. Good to see you too.
Likewise. All right, so any other questions on this before I move on? Okay, so this is only part of the equation. So there's all these federal relief dollars that are out the door and are somewhere between states and districts. Then there's a second batch of spending that's the infrastructure bill that people have heard about. So this was something that was passed at the end of the summer. And this slide sort of breaks down all the different ways in which this funding is divided up. And a lot of this will be grants to states and competitive grants within that. But the big one for schools is broadband. So there are $65 billion in the pipeline now for broadband at the district level over the next 5 years. So think $12 billion a year for broadband. To put that in perspective, all of the relief funding to date funded about $10 billion in broadband assistance. So we're talking about a really big commitment to broadband that will flow out of something called the Economic Development Administration, which is at the Department of Commerce. And there's community college proposal here. There's a K-12 piece for this. And there's, this is the one that I think will be quite a challenge for schools, because I think what's going to happen is, I don't know how it is in your area, but nationwide, the number of devices that are assigned to students has really gone up during the course of the pandemic. So the number of Chromebooks and devices, I think we went from, I saw a study pre-pandemic, there was like one computer for every, like 25% of kids had access to a one-to-one device in their educational experience. And that number is more like 60% now. So, one of the purposes of the broadband initiative will be, it's both connectivity and devices. So anything that falls into that category is fair game in terms of proposals. So, broadband has also been interpreted as supporting infrastructure for virtual learning and virtual experiences as well. So that's the biggest next phase of this. And, in this world where trillions are now the currency and not billions, it's tempting to think, well, it's only 65 billion, but in comparison, that's much, much larger than anything the federal government spent. And I saw something that said in 2020, like the pre-pandemic spending level on broadband across all the schools was about $1 billion a year across all the school districts. So that's the next one I would put in this category. The other thing you'll see is there's also a bunch of assistance that's directed. So all of these infrastructure accounts you see here that are things like water infrastructure and cybersecurity and ecosystem restoration. There's weather hardening and solar deployments. Those are all have set asides for schools as well. So I expect to see some school solar projects, some school wind projects, other things that fall into that category. And also some of the environmental remediation, other things. There's a little provision tucked in there that allows you to spend the funds on outdoor education too. So you can build things that support outdoor learning experience as well. So that's the sort of a next thing that's going to play out. And it's not going to be formula funds that just go to the states and districts. Some of this will be competitive funding. Some of this will be states having to put together plans to be eligible for these funds. And very little of it has happened yet. So this is something like, for example, the administration is planning its first rollout of the broadband initiatives in May. And you'll start to see some of the other things that have become available for schools and districts and so forth after that. So this is sort of an on the horizon, but approaching quickly type of items, all this infrastructure funding. So, that's an opportunity. And again, I think it comes at a time when most people I've talked to at the district leadership level feel really overwhelmed with, managing the pandemic changes and managing all these federal funds. So, it's an opportunity for those who are sort of poised to go after it. And I would think it's a good opportunity for the ecosystem. This is another decision you can have with your decision makers, or another conversation you can have with your decision makers, I should say, to ask, hey, how are we planning on using these dollars? Because I think, we've the Austin STEM ecosystem, and some of you, like Kate, you may have been on the webinar we did last fall. The Austin STEM ecosystem has played a huge role in charting their state's broadband plan in Texas. And a lot of states, I only think maybe 25 states have a statewide broadband plan. So one of the things that's out there is to make sure our stakeholders in STEM are at the table as states figure out what they're going to do on broadband. So enough about broadband. So one other thing I wanted to put on your radar screen, this is a study the National Academies put out last July, the call for action on science education. But one of the things you're seeing emerge in the school conversation now is the impact of having science not as the main focus of the accountability system like math and reading are. We have testing in every grade 3 through 8. Once in high school, it's required to be in the accountability formula for every state and for every school district. And science falls in a different category, so it can be included as an other academic indicator or as an environmental factor in schools. A climate, a school climate factor in schools. So it's sort of in secondary status. And, people can cite the number of the math achievement gaps lost. The science folks have been pretty clear about the fact that this has impacted science to a greater degree. And so I think it's renewing the conversation about, and it's not just the national academies. I mean, they've been helpful, but there's a renewing of the conversation about where does science fall in the priorities of schools vis-a-vis the accountability system. So, that's I think I hope yield a conversation about things other than just standardized tests, because a lot of folks in accountability want to talk about input measures for schools, like measuring, how many science teachers per pupil are there, how many science specialists are there, what are the supports that involve science in schools, what are the material assets available to individual schools, and things that fall into that category. Also measuring things like student interest. So, all of the focus on social emotional learning that's rolled out over the last 5 or 6 years has enabled you to measure these things. And I think those are some alternatives to just the old, bubble tests that people think of when they think of science assessments. The assessments that are lined up around in GSS are much more significant and can give you much more broad information, not just give you a percentile score, but give you a lot of information about where your student is strong and where they need to focus their attention. Those are the things that are sort of in the pipeline around science assessments that I think are really interesting. So there's definitely a pretty interesting conversation. Like, for example, the Department of Education last Thursday hosted a webinar just on this topic. So it's definitely getting some resonance in terms of the discussion. So this is a slide I put in here just to sort of calibrate election season. This is a little bit coy, but I think it's pretty accurate in terms of how things are being perceived right now. The political climate is really hostile right now, and you sort of see this in the environment. But I didn't want to go too much detail on polling and public opinion polling, but the next slide I would show after this one, if we're going to dive into this is perception. If you ask people, what does the other party think, what does the other side think, you get these kind of polling numbers. But you ask people about education or about healthcare or about security or about the economy, you find a lot more in common than you do divisions, right? So a lot of these divisions are things that are a result of the sort of the climate, not the substance, if that makes any sense. And that's part of the reason why this bill is on the horizon. So the House passed something called the America Competes Act. The Senate passed something called the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act. And together, and again, these are numbers that, I don't know how much resonance they have, but this bill would spend $65 billion on semiconductor manufacturing capacity in the United States next year. It's not an authorization bill. It actually includes the funding for it. That's a huge shift in terms of the degree of support the federal government's going to have for science-rich industries in the United States. And it's a direct response to the fact that China and India and other countries are investing in their industries and making US companies like Intel less competitive over time. This has been a sort of an area that federal policy didn't touch for a long time. We said, look, we're going to invest in basic R&D, but we're not going to help individual industries. So this is going to change like the last time something like this happened, where you saw big investments in a short period of time, was the Human Genome Project. And if you know anything about how that played out 20 years ago, the number of PhD applicants in that field went up dramatically. The interest level in that field went up just enormously as a result of huge federal investments in the human genome research world in the mid-1990s. culminating with the sequencing of the genome. This is going to produce something similar to the space race in semiconductor manufacturing, because just to put that $65 billion in perspective, that's like 3 times the budget for NASA in a given year. So it's a significant amount of funding that would flow to semiconductor manufacturing. And it's targeted squarely at China and the sort of US-China gap around semiconductors. So that's an example, because what I expect to see is semiconductors are first, and then you're going to see other strategic industries, make the same argument for we need massive investments in specific industries. So that this is notable because it's going to change the dynamic around how we talk about science and technology policy as a country, and all the roles, the things that go into supporting industries like that. So semiconductors is the rock of this bill, if you will, but it's also got support for advanced manufacturing and other things, and dollars on the table. In the next year, there's something called the Innovation Hubs proposal. It's another $10 billion to build science and technology centers that are based upon the Silicon Valley model in like a dozen different locations to solve some more things. So, for example, like Kansas City, for example, has an animal science corridor that's attached to Kansas City. That's something you may see some investment in. Central Tennessee has investments in the national labs built around Oak Ridge National Lab, for example, right? So you tend to see these hub areas that are regional that are going to see some additional investment from the federal government that's going to be piggybacked on state and local economic development incentives. So to be eligible for these funds, you have to already receive some kind of incentive from the state that you're operating in. So it's designed to piggyback federal funds on top of state economic development priorities. So that's another interesting, change in federal policy that matters. And literally yesterday, the House and the Senate passed a resolution to go into the formal conference process, like the Schoolhouse Rock, how a bill becomes a law conference process, where they're going to have a negotiation between the House and Senate and work out a final deal. And that only happens about once every 5 or 6 years. So that's why I if I seem gleeful, there's a good reason for it. It does a number of things. A number of other things that are important too. It would create a technology directorate at the National Science Foundation that would be specifically focused on commercialization activities and not basic research. Again, a means to support industry broadly in the STEM fields. It has a number of boost to STEM education programs at the NSF. Notably, one of these, and you've probably heard about this, notably one of these that's in play is a set of grants to ecosystems specifically. And we've worked out a legislative definition of what a STEM ecosystem is and are trying to increase the eligibility for ecosystems within the National Science Foundation. There are made in America provisions on the table, and it's also got provisions directed specifically at China and Russia and the reposition of industries away from those supply chains. So a lot going on here. I think there's a really good chance it passes before the July recess, the August recess at the end of July. So we'll see. But this would be a big deal if it passes. And then, in terms of what we're focused on, obviously the competitiveness bill is sort of out there. That's what Congress is really focused on at the national level. There's, as I mentioned, a conversation starting to happen around what do we measure about schools, and our test score is really the primary measurement we want to be using. Look at the movement away from the SAT in college, for example, and apply that same sort of thinking around how you measure K-12 learning. And I think you're going to see some shifts there. We still have to stay on top of federal aid and make sure we could find some better examples as we go into years 2 and 3 around the aid. And I still think it's an opportunity for any local stakeholder like the ecosystem here to have conversations with your district and state leadership about how these funds are being spent and what their priorities are and how they're spending them on science, technology, engineering, and math. And then, one of the things that the STEM issue is probably one of the last issues that's really bipartisan. You see support on both sides of the aisle. So many other education related topics have become really partisan on one side or the other. All you have to do is go to a school board meeting and use 3 words, critical race theory, and you can divide everybody in the room up pretty quickly, right? So there are lots of terms that are charged that way. But we're going to be focused pretty hard on outreach to the Republican side over the course of this year, because I think they're going to end up in charge. And I think it's part of our job to make sure we keep this issue bipartisan and don't turn it into a partisan issue where we work with both sides. And then the last thing I would say is I've touched on economic development a good deal, But I think one of the other things you'll see, and you're seeing this more at the state level too, is that economic development processes are starting to have more meaning when it comes to investments and dollars. And state economic development authorities are getting much more aggressive at recruiting and retaining industry. And that's, part and parcel of the fact of, everybody will tell you right now, it's really hard to hire STEM workers, people with certain technical skills, right? Try hiring a software engineer. Look at the competition that's going on between companies to retain those people. So economic development plans are going to become more meaningful and are going to have more teeth into the education world than they've ever had before. Because again, if you're picking where you're going to locate an industry, having access to a pool of qualified workers in that local area is becoming really, really, really determinative of where those facilities are being located. So I think that's it. So we've got some time for questions and comments or anything if people want.
I have a question. I'm Jill Ott from Science Coach. What we do is we teach teachers how to coach students to do advanced, authentic research, and they enter those into competitions. So we're teaching them how to go to that next level. 89% of our students end up in a STEM career. My question is, there's a lot of opportunities that you mentioned here, but how does a smaller nonprofit like myself navigate that and figure out, okay, where is going to be a good expenditure of time? Do you have any suggestions of how to do that?
Well, one of the things I would say, if I were starting sort of from scratch at this as a a nonprofit that's in one district or one set of schools, right? Something that's on the small side, is I would go look through some of those databases and see where the relief dollars are spent that are closest to where you are in terms of what's a project that's the closest or most similar, right? In your case, has anybody in the region used any of these dollars on science supplemental services or anything that falls into that category, right? That's the first place I'd start to see whether that's even a consideration. The next one is I would get familiar with how the National Science Foundation addresses things like that, because if you had a partner that was in the research world that could evaluate your program, for example, that's the next kind of place people will start. Is you can find federal funds to do an evaluation of a particular science intervention, something that's STEM related. That's another good entry point. And then the third place I would say to go look, and I should have put something up there on these guys. The ecosystems world is pretty closely aligned with something called the STEM Funders Network. And if you look up that term, it's an aggregation of the roughly 36 biggest funders of STEM related projects and programs. And so some of them are community oriented, some of them are very academic, but that's a good place to get a sense for what the community that funds STEM as a strategic priority is funding these days.
Thank you.
You bet.
Yeah, and so related to that point, the one partnership that I've heard of in the region was a $1 million partnership where the money that was allocated to St. Louis public schools through ESSER funds is going to, there's a $1 million contract between SLPS and STL Youth Jobs to deliver STL Youth Job services to SLPS students. So that's the only one I've heard of in the St. Louis region so far, where we've seen an out of school time program partner with an LEA to use those ESSER funds.
Well, and it brings up an interesting point. A lot of times what the districts in big cities are doing is they're relying on some kind of fiscal agent like that to administer a part of the program. And the after school community is a good place to start looking for that, because a lot of times those groups are involved in administering something called the 21st Century After School Program, the existing source of federal funds for after school. And so if you have a few extra dollars, it's usually easier to go through an outside nonprofit partner that's already administering the program. That way you don't have to set one up. All right. Any other questions? Deborah, did we cover your question? I see there was a question in here for a little while ago.
Yes, you did. Thank you. what happened outside.
Okay.
Are ESSER funds be able to be used for teacher professional development?
Absolutely. And this is the hard part for digesting all this. The law explicitly says you can use it for any existing supported activity under current federal law. And so that means everything in Title II that relates to professional development. And if you looked at the federal law, right in the middle of Title II, there's a big provision that says specifically this fund should be prioritized for high need fields like math, science, engineering, technology, and a few other things.
James, do you have any insight into what other STEM backbone organizations are doing around some of these opportunities, kind of like collective asks of legislatures or with school districts?
Well, one of the things that that a couple of states have had legislative activities where what they've done, Pennsylvania is one of these, South Carolina is one of these. There are examples of where the state has gotten together and a group of legislators and said, we're going to require the state to spend relief dollars on this or that purpose that's STEM related. So in Pennsylvania, for example, there's something called the Pennsylvania SMART Initiative, which was a statewide STEM initiative that was funded to the tune of about $40 million a year. It's the largest state STEM initiative. It was started by their Governor Wolf. And one of the things that came up, and it did not pass, but it was debated, was the idea of earmarking a portion of federal funds to support that initiative specifically. So that's one example. The example in South Carolina is one where the after school network in South Carolina specifically got a group together to say that there's a provision in the relief funds that says you have to spend at least 1% on after school. And the state decided not to use that set aside. I mean, this is all a matter of like power politics. It still makes me laugh as somebody who grew up, with Schoolhouse Rock. Like, what do you mean a state can just not do what the federal law requires? But once the money's transferred, it's just a matter of like courts and battles, right? So anyway, so the after school community got together there and they said, look, we need to set up a specific requirement that the funds be spent on that after school world. And then they laid out some priorities for after school, and STEM was one of 3 priorities they set up for doing that. And at the end of the day, the after school network was actually the one that administered the program. So, I mean, there's plenty of room for that. But those are just 2 examples I can think of. Project Lead the Way, I don't know how active they are in St. Louis, but Project Lead the Way is another interesting example of where they've put toolkits and other things in the hands of their coordinating community, the people who are the liaisons to Project Lead the Way at the district level, laying out all the different ways you can use STEM funds. So that's, use federal funds to support STEM, I should say.
Thanks. Okay, if there are no more questions, and I'll pause for a minute to see if anybody else has any questions for James. Oh, are there any programs based around plant science?
Oh, that's a good question. So one of the things, so yes, potentially. So again, and this is why it's so hard to get your arms around these federal dollars, because like I said, the relief funds end up being the province of the people who manage the federal, Title I process. And the Title I office in most big districts is not exactly where you go to look for innovation and doing things in a new way, right? So they were, if you come to somebody and you say, hey, I'm going to give you like 10 years worth of your salary in 1 minute, and you got to spend it in the next hour, it's a pretty stressful job, right? You're going to spend it on more of the things you already spent it on if somebody puts a gun to your head, right? So I want to, give them some slack to start out with. But one of the things you can spend them on are outdoor education and eco education in general. There's a provision in something called Title IV Part A of the Every Student Succeeds Act, which is the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. And there's a website in every state Department of Education that shows you how these funds are spent and how to access them at the local level. But outdoor education and environmental science and plant science are one of the enumerated purposes of those funds. So it's absolutely an allowed activity. You just you have to figure out how to browbeat the people at the district level that are doling out the funds to say, hey, by the way, did you know you can spend money on this? If you look out on our website, and Kate, if you send me a follow-up message, I'll remember to send you this. We have a toolkit that shows you all the details as to how you can use federal funds to support STEM. You just have to, the people who've succeeded have waved this in the face of their district leadership and said, you know, give me something so I'll go away and stop annoying you about it, right? I mean, you have to get pretty direct because these people's lives are really, you know, really complicated by dealing with all these federal funds.
Yeah, that's really
Thank
interesting.
you.
I'm wondering too about some of this competitiveness and the economic development funds that are available. I mean, we've done work here with like the Good Jobs Challenge and Build Back Better on the bioscience industry in the region. So I'm wondering if some of that, like if that's sort of our state level plan for economic development, if there's possibility for some like work-based learning or K-12 STEM education funds that would be related to plant and life science then.
You know, the regional, so one of the things in the competitiveness bill is something called regional innovation hubs. That's the $10 billion aside for sort of Silicon Valley model cluster development. That's sort of the term that's used in the technology world. And one of the components is that you have to have a proposal, a part of that proposal, because they're competitive grants. So you apply to the federal government to get the money, doesn't automatically show up. One of the components of that is how are you supporting the local workforce that undergirds a strategic industry? And so so the author of that bill is from Indiana, and the Indiana Economic Development Corporation, which is their state economic development agency, you know, has been getting together like 3 or 4 industries to consider, okay, our state's really good in agri-science. We've got the Purdue University campus. We have Eli Lilly in Indianapolis. You know, we've got 2 or 3 big strategic sectors that we can build a proposal around. And I wouldn't be surprised if Washington University was involved in that conversation, or, you know, think about the biggest regional economic drivers in Missouri and in the surrounding area. And those are probably likely to be the ones that are talking about this, because I can guarantee you whatever the Missouri Economic Development Agency is has an eye on this, because Senator Blunt's been involved in like these conversations. So, you know, it's I would be surprised if there wasn't already a process going on that you can figure out how to get some standing to get involved with. I mean, an ecosystem, you know, the St. Louis regional ecosystem is absolutely a valuable stakeholder to be involved in those conversations, because you're going to have all the different, you know, education providers of STEM related enrichment activities, you know, somewhere in your network.
Thanks, that's helpful. Okay. Oh, so Jill's asking, so I will follow up with James to get that toolkit on federal dollars for STEM programs. And when I send out the follow-up, that'll have his slide deck and the recording from today. I'll make sure to include that toolkit too. But I want to thank, first of all, James for spending the afternoon with us. This was so incredibly enlightening and sort of gets me excited for all of the people that I need to start talking to about these issues. And then I want to thank everybody who shared their Thursday afternoon with us to have this conversation, to start thinking about how we're accessing funds that are going to deliver high quality, high engagement STEM to all students throughout St. Louis, which is what we all care about here, I know. Oh, and James just dropped that in the chat. So I will make sure to grab that and I will send that out. Okay. Christopher is saying thanks. Whenever I see your name, Chris, is Christopher, I just like read it. I'm like, no, it's Chris. I think Chris and I will follow up with you, James.
Sure. And happy to have, you know, we'd be happy to get the rest. I have a policy team that can, you know, happy to help you, you know, navigate this if it's of a serious interest, because that's what we've done with the other ecosystems that are interested. So happy to help that along.
Yeah, I will absolutely be following up there. So thank you so much, everyone. Stay safe, stay warm. I hope the weather isn't too crazy in Maryland, James. So thanks, everybody. We'll see you next month.
Thank you.
Hi, James.